Hello to everybody who's here and everybody else in the world, I guess.
Hi, William.
I I'm doing an intro. Shut up. Welcome to this is the meeting of the Philosophy Club. I became Comfortable Doug just now, and it's about misinformation, which is hopefully not going to contain any misinformation, though I don't know in advance that that is true for sure. Do I, Professor Carey? You, the evidentialist. Today we have speaking to us doctor and professor of mine, an all-around good dude, Brandon Carey, who is, I believe we have something prepared on misinformation and philosophical problems related thereto. Presumably politics will be very much present, but this is not, I don't think in advance that this is going to be fully about the politics behind misinformation. I may bring that in just because I can't help myself, but there you go. So without further ado, I will turn the mic over to Professor Carey, and we will discuss misinformation. Thank you for coming, I guess.
Absolutely. Happy to be here. Thank you, William. Hi to everyone who's here and anyone who may be watching later. I am indeed here to talk about misinformation. Some of my examples are politically charged in various ways, but William is correct that that's not really the point of my talk, or that's not really the stuff, that's not really the set of problems I'm trying to solve. But to get into the kind of problems I'm trying to solve, let me see if I can share the slides here. Folks see a Chrome window, should be, I think it's working. All right, so basically what I'm trying to figure out is what misinformation is. And that might seem like a question with an obvious answer or something like that. But the obvious answers to that question turn out to not do a very good job of capturing the range of cases that I think people are worried about when they're worried about misinformation. So that's the sort of motivation here, is that I'd like to get an account of what misinformation is that has the appropriate boundaries, that counts all of the stuff that we think is misinformation and doesn't include any extra stuff. So the reason I think that's worth doing, as a philosopher, I feel sort of obligated to defend the value of even like attempting to answer the question that I'm trying to answer. So here's a set of reasons. These are not the only possible reasons you might want to do this, but there are some reasons that I have for wanting to figure out exactly what misinformation is in like a pretty precise way. So one, I think that there should be some consequences for spreading misinformation. Now, maybe those consequences should only happen in certain kinds of cases of misinformation, like maybe only when you knowingly and maliciously spread misinformation or something like that. But at least in a broad range of cases where people are spreading misinformation, I think there should be some consequences. Those might be like really harsh legal consequences, like life in prison, or they might be significantly milder kinds of still legal consequences. So maybe there should be some kind of civil liability for spreading misinformation, at least on a sufficient scale or in a way that leads to certain kinds of harms or something like that. But there also might be just other kinds of consequences. There might just be social consequences, right? Like if you have a friend who's constantly spreading misinformation on social media, maybe you unfollow them. Maybe you stop replying to their text messages. Or there might be economic consequences that you can enforce as consumers on corporations that make money by manipulating people with misinformation, or other things, right? But basically, I think misinformation is basically bad, and that people who spread it have done something bad, again, in the right kinds of circumstances, and they should face consequences for that. And I think if you're going to specify consequences, like if you want to make a rule that says if you spread misinformation, under these conditions, here's the bad thing that happens to you, you should probably have a good definition of misinformation if you're going to write that rule, right? If we were to like pass legislation to criminalize spreading misinformation, that law should include a definition of what misinformation is. And we want that to be precise so that we're not accidentally punishing people for doing something that wasn't what we were trying to criminalize in the first place. So that's one reason I think that we should care about getting a really good, precise definition of misinformation. I also think that social media companies should be required to regulate misinformation on their various platforms in various ways. Some social media companies do this to some degree. out of some combination of good public relations and the goodness of their own hearts and whatever. But we might think that there should be pretty serious regulations for anyone running that kind of organization that requires them to take misinformation seriously and take steps to address it. And if you want to implement that kind of regulation, you should have a good definition of misinformation that gets all the cases right. A third thing, I think that we should teach people how to identify and ignore misinformation. So sometimes people will talk about the sort of rampant spread of misinformation and how a good solution would be media literacy and like teaching children in schools how to sort good information from bad information, how to know when they're being presented with misinformation and, you know, ignore it or dismiss it or whatever. For the record, I think that's actually a really bad solution to our problem, because I think that the problem we face now is that mostly older people, I don't mean like 70-year-olds, but I mean people like your age plus, right, are making a lot of decisions that have huge impact in the world, and they're making those decisions sometimes on the basis of misinformation. So starting a digital literacy program in elementary schools is just like way too late to address that problem, right? But still, I think it's a good idea, right, to teach people how to identify misinformation, even if that's not like the silver bullet to solve all of our problems. And if we're going to do that, we need to know what misinformation is. Now, this third one is kind of trickier than the first two in the sense that we don't just need to know what misinformation is, we need to know how to identify it. And that's actually a second question, right? There's like the kind of metaphysical question of what misinformation is. And then there's the epistemological question, how do you know when something is misinformation, or what kind of evidence demonstrates or indicates that something is misinformation? I'm not going to answer that question at all in this talk, but at least sometimes it helps in answering those kinds of epistemological questions to have the answer to the metaphysical question. Like if you know what misinformation is, that might help you answer questions about how you can identify, right? It also might not help you, but sometimes it does. So at any rate, I think those are some reasons that you might care about getting a good, tight, precise definition or analysis of misinformation, and that's what I'm looking for. Okay. So as I guess like a methodological particularist or something, if I'm going to analyze a concept, I'd like to start with some examples of it so that I can look for common features and try to use those as kind of a basis for coming up with my analysis. So here are some misinformation examples. So as you may be aware, Dominion Voting Systems is currently suing Fox News for defamation. The basis of their claim is that Fox hosts and guests, like talking heads that they had on the network, made a bunch of false claims, claims that they knew were false about the reliability and the security of the voting machines that Dominion provided during the 2020 presidential election. I'm not telling you anything interesting or new that you don't know about that election, right? I'm just giving this as an example of a situation where we have a case of misinformation that seems like really important, right? Like there are many millions of dollars at stake in this lawsuit. If nothing else, that's a reason to care about it. Now, strictly, it's not a lawsuit that alleges that Fox News spread misinformation, because that's not against the law for whatever reason. So probably the First Amendment, but it's a defamation case, right? And there are things about that that actually really complicate it, right? So if Dominion wants to make their case for defamation, it's not enough that they just show that the claims are false, right? Like they can't just demonstrate that their voting machines work and that's it, they win, right? They also have to demonstrate that decision makers at Fox knew that the information they were spreading was false. They also have to demonstrate that the spreading of that false information was like damaging to basically their business interests, right? They have to show that there was a harm. And they have to demonstrate all of those things to a reasonably high legal standard. So all of those things make it sort of difficult to punish people for spreading this particular kind of misinformation. The reason I raise that is mostly that you might think that even if you couldn't establish some of that other stuff, in particular, even if you couldn't establish that the false claims about the voting machines were damaging to Dominion, you might think that decision makers at Fox did something wrong anyway. like, even if it didn't hurt the reputation of this company, you might think it's bad to knowingly spread false information on your news network. And so that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about when I talk about prohibiting spreading misinformation in particular, right? So independent of other things that we might say about, inciting violence or damaging reputations or various other things that already are prohibited, we might think it's bad to just spread misinformation regardless of whatever else is going on in the case. So that's a case that we want to make sure we're counting as a case of misinformation in our theory. Or my theory. This isn't necessarily a collaborative endeavor. We'll see how friendly your questions and objections are. Another sort of good candidate case to think about, YouTube currently has a vaccine misinformation policy. It prohibits videos and comments and other kinds of reactions and posts that spread harmful misinformation about COVID-19 vaccines. It's been a little while since I read the policy carefully, but my memory is that it's a kind of first time you're on timeout, and then you get X number of strikes before your account is banned, which is a sort of familiar pattern from this kind of policing that you've probably encountered before. But what I think is especially relevant, I guess, about the policy is that it's a misinformation policy. So it really is designed to target misinformation specifically. And you would think a policy like that sure should include a very clear, tight analysis definition of what misinformation is. It doesn't, but if we can come up with one, then we'll understand what YouTube's policy says. So if we're going to have policies like that, my real point here is that, like, if we're going to have policies like that, then we should have a clear understanding of what misinformation is. Maybe you think we already do, but at the next part of the talk, we'll see that there are some kind of problems for what might be the obvious starting points for what misinformation is. Another kind of case that I want to make sure we get right, and this creates a problem for one of the first views we'll look at, is that during the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine, there have been a whole bunch of TikTok videos that I would categorize, and I think basically anyone would categorize as misinformation. They are videos that are either fabricated, so like they might be like a video showing tanks rolling around on the ground and fighting each other, but they're like from a video game, right? So they're like artificially generated images, or they might be genuine images of real things that happened that are just posted in a context in a way that makes it seem to the consumer of the video that they're like watching a live video of something happening in Ukraine, when in fact they're not at all. So like it's a real video, it's just not really a video of anything happening right now. So I think we want to count those as cases of misinformation too, and we're going to need a theory that says, yes, those things are also misinformation. Okay, so that's a kind of range of examples. Obviously, I could list examples of misinformation indefinitely. I won't do that, but this gives us kind of a group of things that we know we want to count. And so our theory had better count these things. Okay, so here's the version 1 theory of what misinformation is that it's just false information. So if you look up the word misinformation in a dictionary, that is roughly what you'll get from the dictionary. I say this based on evidence. I looked up misinformation in a dictionary. What it said is that it was false or inaccurate information. And I didn't understand what the difference between false information and inaccurate information was. So maybe inaccurate does some other thing that I don't understand. But I think it really just meant false, right? So if I make a claim and it's inaccurate, that's a false claim. So whatever. Anyway, so this is like a sensible starting point for what misinformation is, and it gets at least a lot of standard cases right. So here's that just as an analysis. Pick some piece of information and plug it in for M. It's going to be misinformation just in case it's false information. As I say, this does well with at least a range of obvious examples of misinformation. So the Dominion Fox case, right? The defamation charge is that Fox's claims about Dominion's voting machines were false. They also seem like misinformation. So assuming Dominion's right, which is probably true, but assuming Dominion's right, that's a case of misinformation. It's also false information. Great, our theory gets that case right. But we run into pretty quick trouble that you may have anticipated, which is that there's two kinds of trouble, really. The first kind of problem is that it's pretty easy to have misinformation that is nevertheless literally true. So here's an example like that. I had to go on Facebook. I had to log in to Facebook and go to like some wild Facebook anti-vax group to get this image for you. So please appreciate my sacrifice. But here's a case of something that seems like clear misinformation to me, but at least when it was posted, this claim was true. So this was posted in January of this year. And the claim was that COVID cases, I'm assuming that means the daily new case rate, are much higher now than before there was a vaccine. We'll forgive the spelling error here. And that was true, right? This was like mid-Omicron, daily case rates were super high, higher than they were before the Pfizer vaccine first became available to people, right? So this claim, at least, interpreted in a reasonable, charitable way, this claim is true. The trouble is this still seems like misinformation because I think, given the context, the point of this elephant picture is that there's some kind of causal connection between people being vaccinated and case rates. Now, there is a causal connection, by the way, between people being vaccinated and case rates. It's just the exact opposite of the connection that's being alleged here, right? That people are somehow, more people are getting sick now, and that's because so many people are vaccinated, is, I think, the implication here. I'm not sure why the elephant is sticking its head through the window. I think it's supposed to be like people are ignoring the elephant in the room thing.
That's my thinking as well. It's the elephant in the room. The thing
But the
that
elephant
Facebook
isn't in the
exposes
room.
nobody
That's
is
my
talking
concern.
about, but it's so obvious, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. We
So
should definitely
I
look
agree.
for-
I think that's supposed to be the thing, but I would just like the elephant to be all the way in the room. That's what you're like. Just draw a little cartoon elephant or whatever. Anyway, so you can think of, like, once you have this idea in your head, you can think of lots and lots and lots of other examples, right, of misinformation, where the way that misinformation works isn't that you say something that is strictly speaking false. You say something that's true that leads people to think something false, right? So there are various ways you could tell this story. You might think it's like some kind of conversational implicature given the context of the conversation or something like that. So you're not saying it, but you're like suggesting it, it's pragmatically conveyed or something like that. You don't even have to tell a story that sophisticated. The basic idea is just that you can say something true that nevertheless leads people to think something false. And those cases still seem like cases of misinformation. Or to me anyway, that seems like a case of misinformation, but it's not false. The only content in the meme here is literally true. So there's no false information. This is, no, I don't know how interesting this is, but there's something here which is interesting to at least some degree, which is that people sometimes compare misinformation to lying and treat them as sort of more or less the same thing. But we generally distinguish between lying and misleading people with the truth. Like, you might think they're both bad or even equally bad, but we usually treat them as different things. But this seems to me to be a case of misinformation just as much as the false claims made by Fox News are a case of misinformation. So that suggests a disanalogy between misinformation and lying. I don't claim that that's like a theoretical virtue or anything, but it doesn't seem like a problem either. It just seems like misinformation and lying are not quite the same thing, and that seems fine. Okay, but even if you wanted to say, well, no, there's misinformation and then there's like true but misleading information, and so we should really keep those separate, and this isn't actually a counterexample, you can say that. But there's a sort of deeper kind of problem, which is that misinformation doesn't have to have any truth value at all. So video examples are good cases of that. So here's a TikTok video. It's very fast. I don't know if you know this, but TikTok videos are short, so it might not be super clear what happened there. But we're watching someone parachuting in some kind of military uniform, and then we're watching someone else react to it. There is technically a statement here. There's no way I'm watching a war on TikTok, which is true, because in fact, that's not video of a war, it's video of a training exercise from 2016. So this person is not watching a war. Well, I mean, maybe this person's watching a war on TikTok and they're just not watching the video we were just watching. But assuming this is supposed to be like this guy watching that video, that statement's true, but that's not the interesting part, right? The interesting part is the video itself. The first part of the video, the parachuting part of the video, this is the misinformation, right? What's happening is that like this person is representing themselves as looking at a video of like currently parachuting troops over Ukraine or something like that, when in fact it's a training exercise from several years ago in a totally different part of the world. This is fake as hell, that's correct. So here's the concern, right? Is that that seems like misinformation, but it's not false information. Videos don't have truth values like on their own. Like if someone says something in the video, their statement can be true or false, but just like a video of a person parachuting, like you can't point to that and say that's true or that's false. You could say other things about it, right? Like you could say that video's fake, right? And there's a good sense in which some videos are fake if they're like artificially generated or have been deliberately manipulated. But even that's not going on in this video. This is a real, authentic video. It's a recording, right? It's just that what it's sort of, what the person who posted the video is kind of representing the video as being a video of. It's not a video of that, right? So there are ways in which we can criticize this video, and I think those ways of criticizing it are what makes it seem like misinformation, but it doesn't, I mean, it just can't be false information because it doesn't have a truth value. Once you get that idea in your head, it's easy to come up with lots of other examples, right? If I plant fingerprints at a crime scene, that seems like a plausible case of misinformation, but fingerprints don't have truth values, so they can't be true, they can't be false. They can be something else though, and that will sort of transition us to our second theory here. They could be misleading, right? So in both the true case and the no truth value case, what we could say about those pieces of information is that they are misleading pieces of information. Where misleading means something like they lead people to have false beliefs. We might want to be more complicated about what misleading is. That's something I've been thinking about a lot, unrelated to this project. So maybe that's not the right understanding of misleading, but that I think is the default understanding of misleading, right? When we talk about misleading people with the truth, what we mean is you say something true rather that leads them to have a false belief. And that seems true of both the elephant meme and the TikTok video, right? Both of them are misleading in that they're likely to lead people to false beliefs, right? Either that COVID vaccines are actually causing people to get COVID, or that maybe the belief is something like, I watched a video of people parachuting over Ukraine today, right? Like if I watched that video and then I formed that belief, that would be a false belief. So here's our updated theory. The problem with misinformation maybe is not that it's false, maybe it's misleading. So any case of misinformation, it's going to be misleading information and vice versa. This helps with the cases we just looked at. It still gets the Dominion case right. So it still gets the case that the first few got right. So when you make false claims to people, if they then believe your false claims, you will have misled them, right? So those cases where a news organization reports something false and people believe that, those will still be misleading. So it captures the thing that the first theory got right, and it helps with the problems that the first theory faces. So that's good. That's exactly what we want from our next attempt at a theory. It's for it to keep all the good stuff and solve all the problems. Unfortunately, this theory has its own problems. So the first is what we might call accidental accuracy. In fact, I did call it accidental accuracy. And you understand what those words mean. You probably already know where I'm going, but here's the idea. Let's suppose that I'm a fitness influencer. This is a distant possible world where I'm plausibly a fitness influencer. And I make a bunch of sponsored posts, and I'm unscrupulous enough that I don't in any way indicate that these are sponsored posts. I'm just saying like, oh, I took my pre-workout today and gosh, it really made me lift harder or something, right? Whatever. I started taking
Extremely convincing influencer talk, by the way.
It's very good. It's the confidence that sells it. I started taking Fat Burn RX and lost 50 pounds in 6 months and whatever, right? Like I say all this stuff that is clearly intended to make my followers believe that these supplements are effective so that they'll buy them. I never do any research. That part's accurate. And I don't even try the supplements, let's suppose, because I'm like, I don't know what this weird stuff is. I'm not going to try it. I don't have to try it to sell it, right? So I'm just not even going to bother. I just say whatever the sponsors, indicate that they want me to say their product does. But let's suppose that, just by sheer dumb luck, one of the posts I make says something true. So maybe this fat burn tea that I'm advertising really does make you burn more calories, right? Like maybe it elevates your metabolism in some way, and your daily caloric burn is a little bit higher than it would have been otherwise. Like there is a genuine causal connection. Maybe the folks at Fat Burn don't even know that there's an actual causal connection because they didn't research it either, but it just turns out that there is, right? Like sometimes that happens. Sometimes you believe something for no reason at all or really bad reasons, and nevertheless it turns out to be true. So I'm going to ask a question, but then I'm just going to immediately answer it. Yes, this is still misinformation. This post is misinformation just as much as all of the other posts were misinformation. Because the issue with the problem with my posts, whatever it is, isn't that they lead people to false beliefs. I mean, that's bad. But the one accurate post among the many misleaders, the fact that that one actually leads people to believe something true doesn't like exonerate it. It doesn't save it from the charge of misinformation. I should be blamed for this one just as much as the others. The blame there is like epistemic or something. So whether there's a sensible concept of epistemic blame is maybe something else we could talk about. But I've been a bad part of the epistemic community to the same degree and in the same way, in the case where I get it right as in the case where I get it wrong. So all you really need here is the very commonplace idea that like even a broken clock is right twice a day. There's like some famous Churchill quote about like one of the most important lessons to learn is that even a fool is right every so often, or he probably said it better than that, right? But all we need is this basic idea that a bad source of information can kind of accidentally give you the truth. But when it does, it still seems like misinformation. It still seems like it should be put in roughly the same category as the other kinds of cases of misinformation we were talking about. Or so I claim. So I'm willing to hear arguments on that, but it still seems like misinformation to me, but it's not misleading. This one post is not misleading because my followers who believe what I said in the post, they end up believing something true. So that's one problem. There's another problem, and it's really maybe kind of like a family of problems or something. I haven't made very good sense of that yet. But the concern is something like this. You can spread misinformation and not lead anyone to believe anything new, and it still looks like misinformation. So the case I'm going to focus on is like misinformed suspension of judgment, like where you withhold belief and you don't believe either way, but it's on the basis of misinformation. So I don't know if this is a true story or not. That is, I don't know whether the sequence of events I'm going to describe has actually happened or not, but it seems to me that it could, right? So suppose that there's some reliable news source, whatever it is, that's informing people about some important events in some part of the world. And someone wants to, they want people to not believe that stuff, whatever it is, right? So they're reporting that some corporation is doing some evil thing, and the corporation would like people to not believe that. Well, one thing they might do is try to convince people to believe that, in fact, the corporation is not doing this evil thing, right? To try to lead them to the false belief that the corporation has done nothing wrong. But they could probably get away with doing a lot less than that. If they can just kind of muddy the waters of information enough that people aren't sure what to think, and so they just don't have a belief either way about whether this evil thing is happening, that might be good enough, right? And it might be easier because all you have to do is set up another source that seems just about as reputable, right? And then the information people have is, well, there's this one source that seems pretty good that says something bad is happening. There's this other source that seems pretty good that says there's nothing bad happening. They seem equally strong to me. So I shouldn't believe one or the other. I should just suspend judgment. I should just give up my belief that something bad is going on, right? In that kind of case, the information isn't misleading in the sense that it doesn't lead people to have a false belief, right? Like we're not taking people with no opinion and leading them to an incorrect opinion. What we're doing instead is we're taking people who have a true belief and we're convincing them to give it up. That still seems like we've used misinformation in a kind of epistemically bad way. Our misinformation didn't have full effect, you might say. Like we didn't get as far as convincing them to believe the opposite of the truth or the negation of the truth. But we did succeed in something bad, which is that they had a true belief. I mean, plausibly, they knew that there was this bad thing going on. And now we've convinced them to give up that belief. So they don't know it anymore. They used to believe something true, and now that true belief is gone. So that seems like a case of misinformation to me. But we didn't succeed in misleading anymore in this case, right? No one was led to a false belief. It's like we made the sort of epistemic community worse off. We didn't do it by adding a bunch of false beliefs, which is like the standard case, right? Like that's what the Dominion case is like. We add a bunch of false beliefs. Instead, we subtracted a bunch of true beliefs from the epistemic community. And that also seems bad. Not in exactly the same way, but in a kind of related way, right? So sometimes people talk about the sort of twin goals of either belief generally or of like epistemically rational belief, right? Where you're trying to believe the truth and avoid believing falsehoods. We do both things, right? Well, we didn't lead people astray in the second way. We didn't lead them to a falsehood, but we did lead them astray in the first way. We got rid of one of their true beliefs. Okay, so I'm worried about that kind of case also. Not that we led them to the truth, but that we just led them to give up a true belief that they had previously. And then when I start thinking about that kind of case, I worry about even weaker cases, right? So what if people have like really excellent reasons to believe something? We put out some misinformation. It's only like minimally effective, right? Like they're just like garbage Twitter bots that are saying like, no, nothing's going on. So like people aren't convinced and they don't even give up their beliefs, but they're a little bit less confident than they were before, right? Because they've got like some kind of weak counter evidence. That still seems like misinformation to me. It's just like not maximally effective misinformation, right? It didn't even go so far as to lead them to suspend judgment. They didn't even give up a true belief. We have the same number of true beliefs in the epistemic community, but it still seems like people are less confident of their true belief than in some sense they should be. Like they're less confident than they were before we gave them this bad information. Okay, so two different kinds of problems here for the misleading information account. I'm worried about both of them, but I guess I think the first one is the knockdown problem, right? Like you can lead people to the truth and it still seems like a case of misinformation. You can even give people a justified true belief and it'll still seem like a case of misinformation, right? So imagine that instead of being a fitness influencer who like, you know, maybe in some sense my followers should be able to tell that I'm an unreliable source. Suppose that instead of doing that, I hatched this plan whereby I'm going to hack into the New York Times website and plant a false story. But the problem is I'm an idiot. And so the false story that I'm planting is actually true. I have no idea that it's true because I'm a fool, right? But I'm nevertheless a sophisticated enough hacker to plant this story on the New York Times website. Well, then when people read it, I mean, it's on the New York Times, right? That's a good justification. That's a good reason to think that the story you're reading is true. So they'll have a justified belief. It happens to be true because I screwed up, right? But still seems like I was spreading misinformation there, right? So like not only were they not misled, they got a justified true belief, which is pretty good. I don't think they got knowledge, but they got a justified true belief, which is pretty good. But still seems like that was a case of misinformation. So that seems like the real bummer of a problem here is this kind of accidental accuracy case. Okay, so if misinformation doesn't have to mislead, then like, what is it? How do we what category can we identify here? What two cases of misinformation have in common? Well, here's another idea. This is my old idea. This is my last fall theory. As we'll see, it maybe doesn't quite work. But notice that in the case I was talking about, where you get a justified true belief based on misinformation, it still doesn't seem like knowledge, or at least it doesn't seem like knowledge to me. It's not a perfectly standard Gettier case, but it is Gettier-like in the sense that you have good justification for believing something. That thing is also true, but the truth of the claim and your justification for the claim are not hooked up in the right way. And I would love to make that more precise, but as those of you who've taken 180 with me know, there's no good way of making that precise yet. We have not solved that particular problem. But that's my sense of the case, right? Is that I have good reasons for my belief, but it's only accidentally true. So it doesn't seem like knowledge. It's just by true belief, but not knowledge. So maybe that's the problem with misinformation. The problem isn't that it's always false. The problem isn't that it always leads you to believe something false. Maybe the problem is that it leads you to beliefs that aren't knowledge. So here's a view that kind of gets that idea. So a case of misinformation is, an item of information is misinformation, just in case a belief based on that information would not be knowledge. There are some technical problems with the way I formulated this, but those aren't the kind of interesting problems. I'm just like imagining, take this information, if someone took that information at face value and believed it, would that belief be knowledge or not, right? This view has some virtues, which is why I thought it was true before. Information that sort of doesn't work as a grounds for knowledge in this way could be different. There could be lots of kinds of information that would sort of satisfy this, right? So think about if the belief in question ended up being false, right? Like if you were misled by the information, well, that wouldn't be knowledge because you can only know things that are true, right? Truth is a necessary condition for knowledge. So this would count any cases of misleading information. It would also count cases where the information is false, but you think it's true, and so you believe it, right? So like the Dominion case. So that's good. It counts those cases that do seem like misinformation. It would also include irrational beliefs. So it might be that there's misinformation that, well, okay, that was way too, it's definitely the case that there is misinformation that misleads people, but not like that New York Times case where we actually give them a good reason to believe that the claim is true. We mislead them by like emotionally manipulating them, say, right? That's a super effective and common kind of misinformation. And those people end up believing things, and maybe sometimes they end up believing things that are true. But if we've persuaded them in this way that isn't like we gave them good but misleading evidence, but instead we just like manipulated them or tricked them or whatever, those beliefs are plausibly irrational or unjustified. So this would also count those as cases of misinformation, because if you're going to know a proposition, your belief in that proposition has to be rational or justified. So these would also be covered. Those kinds of cases would also be included. That seems good. That seems like misinformation. And this would also include these accidentally true beliefs, right? Because of sort of general but very hard to make precise intuition that if you're going to know P, it can't be luck that you're right about P. It can't be an accident that your belief that P is true. So for these reasons, I used to think this was basically the right view. If you have time to kill, you can read a blog post that I made on the department blog defending basically this view. But now I'm convinced that it's not right. And there are two kinds of reasons. So one reason that I think it's possible to solve, although it's hard to see exactly how that would work, is that you can have beliefs that are in some sense based on misinformation that are very clearly cases of knowledge. And the cases I have in mind are beliefs that you have probably formed during this talk, right? So like if you looked at any of the examples of misinformation that I presented here, and you formed the belief that is a piece of misinformation, Well, in some sense, your belief is based on that information, but I'm pretty sure you know it's a case of misinformation, right? So it is misinformation, but it's not true that your belief based on it is not knowledge. Your belief is very much knowledge. Now, as I say, I think it might be possible to solve this problem by like zooming in on exactly what I mean by based here, right? Like your belief is based in part on the elephant meme or whatever, right? And that is misinformation. But your belief isn't based on that in the way that like the people who take that meme seriously are basing their beliefs on it, right? Like they're treating that as a reason or an item of evidence in a way that you are not when you form your belief that it's a case of misinformation. So there might be a way of fixing this. It's probably really hard to specify like exactly what kind of basing counts, but maybe it's fixable. And that's sort of where I was when I wrote that post on the department blog. I was like aware of this problem, and I thought, well, maybe I can figure out a way to solve it. But that's not going to work. I mean, maybe that will work, but that won't save this view because this view has a much bigger problem. And the much bigger problem is statistical evidence. And by that, I mean like bare statistical evidence, where all you have to go on is the statistics. So two kinds of cases will be familiar to folks who've taken 180, but just for those who haven't or who haven't in a while and would like a refresher, suppose you buy a ticket in a large, fair, single winner lottery. There are lots and lots of tickets. You have like at least a rudimentary grasp of probability. And so you know that it's just very, very unlikely that your ticket will win. Or alternatively, it's very, very probable that your ticket will lose. And on that basis, you believe that your ticket will lose. It is intuitive to a lot of people, including myself, that even when that belief is true, even if your ticket is in fact going to lose, you don't know that it's going to lose on the basis of that kind of evidence, right? And there are various ways of defending that, but I'll settle for just like intuitively, it seems to me like you don't know your lottery ticket's going to lose. Another kind of case, suppose that, well, here's a new example I've made up to illustrate this point, so I'll try it out on you folks. Suppose that you like work at the courthouse and you have a bunch of files about various trials that are going on, right? And you have 100 of them. And what you know about these files is that the top one, the person is innocent, right? So the determination has been made based on the evidence that the person that the top file is about is innocent of whatever they've been charged with. And the 99 folders below that, those people are all guilty, right? So you got one innocent person, 99 guilty, one file corresponding to an innocent person, 99 files corresponding to guilty people, right? But then you trip and you fall and the folders scatter and you have to sort of hastily put them back in a stack, right? And you think, oh man, which one was on top? I can't remember which one was on top. I can't remember which one is the innocent person. And you think, oh gosh, well, I just won't tell anybody about this. What I'll do is I'll go and I'll hand the folders in, right? And when someone asks me as I hand them a folder, they ask, hey, is this person guilty or innocent? I'll think, well, there were 100 folders, 99 of them were guilty. So as I hand this folder over, I'll say, this person was guilty, right? Because probably, right? There's like a 99% chance that I got it right and that person really is guilty. That seems like a case where if you make your decision that way, you pick one of the folders at random when you knew going in that there was one innocent and 99 guilty. If you pick one at random, very, very probably that person is guilty, but you don't know that person is guilty. Even though, given your evidence, it's extremely probable that they are, you don't know that they are. They shouldn't be convicted. They should reevaluate the file, right? So that's that's my new version. That's my new example to illustrate. It's called the proof paradox. The basic problem is that like bare statistical evidence doesn't seem like it can be enough for us to impose various kinds of sanctions. And one way of understanding that is because it's not good enough for knowledge. Okay. The point of all of that is that still doesn't seem like misinformation. Your information in the lottery case isn't misinformation, but if you base your belief that your ticket is going to lose on that kind of bare statistical evidence, you're not going to have knowledge. So now we've got the opposite problem that we had in the coming to know that something is misinformation case. Now we've got beliefs that aren't knowledge based on this information, but that's not because the information is misinformation. It's like the wrong kind of information to get you knowledge, but it turns out that not all information that's insufficient to grant knowledge is in fact misinformation. So that sucks, because I was really sort of getting interested in this view and I thought it might be going somewhere, but that's a pretty bad problem. And I don't have like any kind of good idea how to solve it. In fact, I'm pretty confident it can't be solved unless we commit ourselves to something implausible, right? Like we could say, yeah, you do know in lottery cases, then this problem goes away. But I mean, that's just to say that you can save any philosophical theory by believing something ridiculous. So I don't think there's a good way out of this one. So I need a new idea. I have a new idea, thank goodness, because man, it's a bummer to try to get a paper published when like the last paragraph is, oh, and by the way, my view's false. So I have a new idea. My new idea has to do with the idea of epistemic harm. And it goes roughly like this. So this is like super new. I don't have any details worked out, but this is the basic notion. So misinformation is a kind of information, and it's information that is disposed to cause epistemic harm. And what I mean by that is that if you give people this information, it makes them epistemically worse off. So think about like, you can be in a good epistemic position or a bad epistemic position, right? I have sort of first sort of ground floor approach, like your beliefs can match up with the world pretty well, or they can be wildly off, right? Like your beliefs could be mostly true, or they could be mostly false. And the first scenario sounds mostly better than the second scenario, right? Like you want your beliefs to kind of align with how the world is. As another layer, your beliefs could be mostly justified or rational, or they could be mostly unjustified and irrational and held for bad reasons. The first one seems basically better than the second one, other things being equal, right? Your beliefs could be mostly knowledge, or they could be mostly accidentally true, justified beliefs. Like you could know a bunch of stuff about the world, or you could be Gettiered about a bunch of stuff about the world. The first one seems better than the second one. Like if you had to pick and only epistemic considerations mattered, I would pick the first one, right? So none of that gives like a very clear definition of what I mean by epistemic harm here, but it gives us this idea that we can say, okay, some epistemic situations are better than other epistemic situations. And so information that tends to worsen your epistemic situation, to decrease its quality along any of those dimensions, and maybe other dimensions too, like whatever dimensions matter epistemically, that is what I'm now starting to think misinformation is. I think this view has virtues. It does good things, given the range of cases we've talked about, right? So if we understand misinformation as just epistemically harmful information, we can talk about a bunch of different ways in which it can harm you, right? So it might lead you to form false beliefs. Well, like I said, having true beliefs seems basically better than having false beliefs. So information that leads you to false beliefs will tend to be epistemically harmful. It might lead you to unjustified beliefs, right? So if I manipulate you, like I irrationally manipulate you with my misinformation, and you end up having a belief that is poorly supported based on bad reasons, that also seems to worsen your epistemic position. That seems like misinformation, so that's good. Accidentally true beliefs will fit the same kind of bill, right? So if I deliberately put you in a Gettier case, right? Like I've done something kind of bad to you, I've worsened your epistemic position. Or, and here's what I think is maybe especially helpful about this kind of view, it might harm you not by adding any new beliefs, but by subtracting good beliefs that you previously held, right? So when I was worried about the kind of situation where you're misled into suspending judgment on something, or where you get some misinformation that doesn't even lead you to give up your belief, but you're a little bit less confident in your true belief than you were before. Those seem like situations where, at least in some intuitive sense, your epistemic position is worse than it was before you got that information. So you've been epistemically harmed. The statistical information cases are complicated in certain ways. I think this view handles them better than the previous view, because what you could say about the lottery case on this kind of view, right? So suppose like you don't know the odds in the lottery, and then someone explains to you, well, look, there's lots of other tickets, and so there's a very good chance that your ticket is going to lose. Well, it's true that if you believe your ticket's going to lose on that basis, you won't know that your ticket's going to lose. But I don't think that your epistemic position overall is worse than it was before you got that information, right? Like now what you've added is a justified, well, I'll hesitate on justified. What you have is a true belief that is supported by statistical evidence. So that's a good thing to add to your stock of beliefs, right? It's not as good as adding knowledge, but you're still better off than you were before you understood the odds in the lottery. Or so it seems to me, like epistemically, you're better off. So I can say, it is at least like consistent with this view, I can say, well, yeah, those statistical evidence cases, it's true that it's not as good as knowledge, and it's true that a belief based on that wouldn't be knowledge, but that doesn't automatically mean that it's misinformation, because it's not epistemically harmful. It's not making you worse off in terms of your epistemic situation than you were before. So I'm not committed to saying those cases are cases of misinformation, which seems good because they just don't seem like misinformation at all to me. So that's where I am. This is my best idea. It seems to get the kinds of cases I've thought of so far, right? But I'm sure I haven't thought of all the cases so far. It has all of the virtues of the previous views. That is, it gets all the cases they get right still. I think, Fox spread epistemically harmful information about Dominion. I think, anti-vax memes are generally epistemically harmful. There's tricky stuff to answer about what it means for something to be harmful, like set aside epistemically, set aside talking about information. Like if you want to talk about a chemical being harmful, it's hard to give a very precise account of what that means. Like you're saying something about a causal relation with some kind of bad state. But it's tricky because most things that are harmful only under some sets of conditions and not others. I don't necessarily think that's bad for the view, because I think that's true of misinformation also. So like, I think the examples of misinformation that I showed you are harmful under some conditions. I think the elephant meme in its native environment on Facebook is epistemically harmful. I think it worsens people's epistemic positions. I don't think that my showing it to you here made you epistemically worse off. So I think under these conditions, in this context, presented in this way, something like that, it doesn't have the effect of misinformation. So I would have to say something complex here about what it means for it to be harmful. But it's something like a disposition to cause harm under a certain set of conditions to be filled in later. So anyway, that's the view. That's why I hold it. I'm happy to answer questions or take objections, or I don't know, whatever you folks do here.
I got some. So for this last, for epistemic harm, does it include, it says there for accidentally true beliefs. What is the difference there? Does it harm if it ends up not being true? Like
Yes, I'm thinking that an accidentally true belief, even though it's true, we might say makes your epistemic position worse if you would have had knowledge otherwise. So like you might be in a circumstance where like you're going to a news site to try to know something about the world, and because of some weird, like stupid hacker hacked the New York Times story or like whatever goofy thing I make up, It turns out that you end up with a true belief. It's even justified and well supported, but like you should have had knowledge. Like that should have been the outcome from that process of like going to the the newspaper of record and like trying to find out about the world. And instead you got this worse thing. So that's the sense in which I think you're epistemically harmed by that kind of misinformation.
Do you
Now,
think you're, oh, good.
I was just gonna say it's kind of tricky because I have to walk a fine line, because I want to say in the statistical evidence case, you got a true belief that's not knowledge, but that's okay. That's not harmful, right? But then in other cases, you're getting a true belief that's not knowledge, and I have to say it is harmful. But something about that seems intuitively correct to me. Like I think being Gettiard is bad, but I don't have anything super clean to say about why that's the case.
Well, if you have knowledge of something and that knowledge ends up to be false later on, where is that on the scale of like epistemic harm?
Good. So I'll say that for my part, I think the situation you just described is technically impossible. So I think if you knew it, it had to be true. Now you might have like thought that you knew it, or maybe like everybody believed it and everybody talks like they knew it, and that could all be true. And maybe even had good reasons to believe it. But if it wasn't in fact true, then I think it was never knowledge in the first place. So that would just be a case of a false belief, maybe a well-justified false belief. And so it would be harmful under this first category where you're forming a false belief.
Now I see kind of a spectrum to this, where on the far end of misinformation, I have malice, where that's you're causing harm by spreading this, and that's the intent behind it.
Mm-hmm.
Short of that, I have skepticism, where skepticism, I'm conveying skepticism in this of, that belief, I don't quite believe that. Doesn't it make sense that this could also be so? And I feel like that could do the same thing in spreading misinformation. I did not collect that information to the same degree that this information was collected by the New York Times. But if the skeptical view and the primary view were collected in the same way, same level of sources, same level of knowledge of this thing, and they're conveying that to you, I would say those would be equal.
Okay, so you're thinking like we have two sort of equally carefully investigated stories that are incompatible with each other, right? One of them is true. I mean, at most, one of them is true, right? But
I'm trying to avoid true to just in general, but
yeah, well, so if we're not gonna worry about the question of who got the story right, if it's just like you've got these two different good investigations of the issue and they gave us different conclusions or something like that. Yeah. From just that description, I don't think we have to say that either of them is misinformation. And from just that description, I don't think it follows that either of them is epistemically harmful, right? They might both be giving you good evidence. Sometimes that happens, right? Like you have two good sources of evidence that disagree with each other, right? Like smart philosophers disagree about stuff all the time. They're still both good sources of evidence. So again, from just those details of the case, it doesn't seem to me like a case of, or it doesn't seem like it has to be a case of misinformation. And it doesn't seem obviously epistemically harmful. So far, I think it's not bad for my view, at least.
Fair enough.
So
I feel like
these threads for now, we have we may come back to them in context, but I do want to make sure we have everybody who wants to contribute able to. I think Daniel was first to raise a hand, and then we have Rex. If it's
yeah, that's right. Daniel, what's up?
I shall attempt to be brief. I have never once succeeded in my life, but we're gonna try. So I was sort of thinking along similar sort of lines here during this presentation, but what I think it sort of has to do with more of like a facade of epistemic legitimacy, because what I sort of have in mind here is like, let's say, after we teach these media literacy classes to children and everything, like people just stop falling for misinformation. It just loses all effect whatsoever. Total massive success. I think metaphysically, like misinformation still like exist, or at least could theoretically exist in that context, but it would be as stipulated by the hypothetical, it would no longer be causing epistemic harm. It would sort of disregard it. And so what I have in mind is something like, M is information if and only if M presents a level of epistemic legitimacy that is not accurate of M's actual level of epistemic legitimacy, where that it's truthfulness, it's well researchedness, it's is it appropriately taking in context, even as like is it are they operating in good faith, all of those things, like not merely its truth value there. My concern with that though is I'm thinking of, because I love April Fool's Day, it's my favorite day of the year, like April Fool's Day jokes by those standards, they present a level of epistemic legitimacy that they don't actually have. That's sort of whole function of the joke. But like, do we want to call those misinformation? It feels like we are sort of like, we tend to think of it misinformation as something more seriously than that, but maybe that's a null and void thing and they are just misinformation. But those are my thoughts.
Yeah, good. So 3 things there. All good to think about. So one is this idea of like having like a false or misleading air of epistemic legitimacy, like trying to pass yourself off as real good information instead of the garbage information that you are, or something like that. And that's something that I've been thinking about a lot in connection with the statistical evidence kinds of cases, right? So one reason that I think intuitively, like my evidence about the odds of the lottery doesn't seem like misinformation is that it's not like misrepresenting itself, right? Like it's not as though my statistical information, I mean, not that my statistical information can talk to me, but it's not like it's coming to me and saying like, hey, I saw the lottery drawing and somebody else won, right? Like that's not what's happening. If it were doing that, then maybe it would seem like it's misleading me or passing itself off as something that it's not, or something like that, right? And then maybe it would seem like misinformation. So I think that's a good thing. And it's possible that it should be baked into the definition of misinformation, that it is like somehow trying to pass itself off as legitimate information. I have a hard time specifying, I have a hard time getting any more precise about what like the legitimate good information is. Like you might say, well, it's not trying to pass itself off as knowledge level information or something like that. And maybe that leads you somewhere good, but I'm worried that you can have information that comes out as not being misinformation or epistemically harmful, even though it doesn't meet that standard. So all of that is to say, I think that's a good idea. I don't know whether it works out for sure, but it's in the range of conditions or like additional conditions or possible replacements that I'm considering, because it might be a necessary component of misinformation. I think whether it is ties into the third thing about the April Fool's jokes. So here's a related problem I'm worried about. I'm worried about the onion, right? So we say that the onion is misinformation. I just read a paper last week that didn't quite say it was obviously not misinformation, but that said that it was obviously not fake news. And I was like, is it obviously not fake news? Like there's a sense in which it's like classic fake news or something.
Exactly. Some precisely fake news.
Right.
But there's the conceit, right? That it's fake, that it tells you so it doesn't have the effect of making you worse off epistemically, we could say, is where I'm taking that in my head.
Yeah, exactly, right. And I think like there's a similar thing here, right, where the onion, well, it's slightly complicated, right? Like within a given article, part of what makes it work is that the onion is trying to have like this air of epistemic legitimacy. That's part of why it's funny, right? But like if you zoom out a little bit, like and think about the mission of the site as a whole, it's obviously not doing that, right? So there's this connection there to, if you wanted to say the onion is not misinformation, adding this kind of condition to your theory of misinformation would be one way of doing that, right? You could say, well, the onion is not passing itself off as a legitimate source of knowledge about the world. And so that's why it doesn't qualify. even in cases where it ends up being epistemically harmful, right? In cases where people eat the onion and believe the story, right? They have been made epistemically worse off. But you might think that still the onion shouldn't be lumped into the same category as, I think, like what people now think of as a standard fake news site. So there is that connection, and I think that might be useful that kind of idea might be useful in making that kind of distinction.
Yeah.
There was a second thing. Oh, the second thing, the middle thing that you said, Daniel, that I also wanted to talk about is this idea of, suppose we're so good at teaching media literacy that no one is taken in by misinformation anymore. Well, then it's not going to be epistemically harmful, right? So that seems bad for the view, because it doesn't seem like we should be able to teach misinformation out of existence, or like out of possible existence, right? And I agree. I think that can be answered, but it is answered by this idea of dispositions to cause harm under certain conditions, right? So I think you could describe a chemical as harmful and say, because this chemical is harmful, we're going to give people regular injections that make them resistant to it. And the injections work so well that actually the chemical doesn't harm anybody now. And so someone says, well, hey, we should just stop giving people the injections because that chemical is not harmful. Look, I'm going to eat some right now, right? I think in that kind of case, we should say, well, no, the chemical is still harmful. It's just only harmful under the appropriate set of conditions, like when people haven't been taking their shots. And I want to say the same thing about misinformation. It's epistemically harmful in the relevant set of conditions. Now, I realize that sounds super weaselly, but I think we have to say that about all dispositional properties, basically. So think about like physical characteristics of things, like a glass is fragile, and a part of what we mean by that is that if you drop it, it will break. Well, sure, if you drop it on a planet with, that exerts gravitational force like as much as the Earth or more, but there are some places you could drop it and it wouldn't break. That doesn't mean it's not fragile, right? So I think we're stuck with that problem for just dispositions and ideas like harm generally. But yes, it is a thing to worry about.
That makes sense. I'll go to Rex real quick. I'm still just a little just to push back a little bit on there. Like I don't know, like it sort of seems like then that like theoretically all kind of like bad ideas of the past are still misinformation, and that doesn't quite seem accurate either, because like I'm trying to draw an example off the top of my head and sort of like drawing a blank, but I mean like I don't know, like at one point in time there would have been, misinformation spread about, I don't know, whatever oppressed group of your choice, but like at least theoretically, like that's not believed anymore. That's not even sort of like effective and more like I don't know, at some point it's just like I don't know, you I guess you kind of already judged me and said that sounds a little weaselly, but it just still seems a little off to me to say that like no, it's still harmful, we're just resistant to the harm. Like I don't know how that really would work in sort of an epistemic sense, I guess.
Yeah, well, so I don't have anything new to say. I don't have.
I realized that I didn't have anything new to say either, like about halfway through that sentence.
Yeah, I don't know how to ease your concerns. I just think like however we handle dispositional properties, like we have to be able to say that like, that like COVID is infectious, even if people were perfectly well vaccinated. We should still say it's an infectious disease, even though it doesn't succeed in infecting anybody anymore. There has to be a way to make sense of that. I don't know what it is because I'm not a good enough metaphysician, but probably there's like the one true account of dispositions and how they work, and maybe this problem is already solved. I'm just not. I don't read broadly enough to know the answer to that question. But I think I guess I think that sort of general problem is not unique to epistemic harm. I think it's a problem we have for like the concept of a thing being harmful, is that it's only going to be harmful under appropriate conditions.
I remember the other thing I was going to say, and then swear I will hand the floor over to you, Rex. Is that like you sort of talked about like it's sort of presenting as knowledge level when it's not knowledge level. I do sort of mean it kind of more broadly. It's just that whatever level of epistemic strength or more broadly legitimacy it's presenting is this could be something like I'm just trying to like answer honest questions here. I don't really know. That person's not saying that they know anything. They're not trying to present knowledge. They're not even trying to present necessarily particularly high confidence in anything, but they're trying to do something not on the up and up. And, so just whatever level of epistemic legitimacy, well-researchedness, like good faith argumentation, all those sort of epistemically virtuous traits it's presenting as having, it is deficient in, and defining misinformation along those lines.
Right. So the view would be something like there's however epistemically good or valuable the information sort of presents itself as being, and as long as it's not worse than that, it's not misinformation. That kind
Yes.
of
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting view that I'm, as I said, is something that I'm thinking about, but I don't have a clear counterexample to it. I don't know whether it gets every case right, but I don't know that it doesn't. So yeah, it would be interesting to see whether it's a good replacement for this condition, and also how they might work together, right? Because we could require both, and see what that does. Yeah, so interesting idea. I don't know the answer, but I'm working on it. So
Rex, the floor is yours.
All right, so I'll turn the video on while I'm talking. Sorry about that. No. I've two questions, and this might be jumping out of epistemology and more into the realm of ethics and political philosophy. But I'm going back to the second slide where you mention there should be consequences for misinformation. Now, on one hand there, I think that, if you're going out lying and people know that, there's automatic social consequences. Now, we go to point 2, it says social media companies should be required to regulate misinformation on their platforms. And then point 3, we should teach people how to identify and ignore misinformation. Now, with that in mind, in the last slide about misinformation as epistemic harm, my concern here is that if right now, obviously we're all in the hypotheticals, but if that were set up as a legal precedent, this could establish a sort of what I'm going to call neo-orthodoxy, where there's an orthodox doctrine of truth that may or may not be actually known globally as truth that you have to believe. Basically, that's the truth. There's the true interpretation of this news article, and you're going to be punished. And if you follow some religion or political philosophy that breaks with said interpretation, you're going to be reprimanded. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense as a concern?
It does, yeah. I tried to sort of vaguely gesture at sort of restricting those claims I made in the second slide there about like there's consequences for this, and social media companies should regulate. And I think that there's like there's a charitable way of understanding what I said there where it's true, but there would need to be lots of caveats to that. So I think so just to take a super simple example, people can accidentally spread misinformation. And I mean, they do it all the time, right? Because they think it's good information. They have no idea that they're spreading epistemic harms to other people, right? Do I think those people should be imprisoned? No, probably not, right? That would be wild. And nor do I think that the sort of, that it would be best handled by like setting up a ministry of truth that determines all of the true propositions. And if you say any false proposition, or the proposition is deemed false by the ministry, you face consequences, right? But I don't think we have to go anywhere near that far to implement the kinds of consequences that I have in mind, right? So like we already have a system for evaluating whether a claim is true, right? Like we do that all the time in the criminal justice system. We do that all the time in settling civil cases, right? If you just think about the Dominion Fox case, right? Like it's built into the definition of defamation that the claim has to be false. So we are already making determinations of whether propositions are true or false, and then issuing consequences on the basis of those determinations. And so my proposals about sort of consequences for misinformation and what kinds of regulations should be put into place and all that sort of thing, I intend those to be folded into the same kinds of systems. So we don't need a ministry of truth. We need a jury of my peers or whatever, if we're talking about criminalizing it to determine. And we would have a high standard of evidence, right? In order for me to face consequences, like assuming we're talking about like actually criminalizing spreading misinformation, right? They'd have to demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt that it was in fact misinformation. Maybe the law also says that I had to know that it was misinformation, or at least that it would be reasonable for me to believe that it's misinformation. And they would have to establish that with some kind of evidence. So I don't think any sort of draconian totalitarian concerns immediately follow from the idea that like, yeah, spreading misinformation seems bad and we probably shouldn't just let people do it with impunity, because, this is sort of another thing that I think might be a virtue of understanding this in terms of epistemic harm. If we really take the idea of epistemic harm seriously, people and organizations and whatever that spread misinformation, like knowingly and maliciously, are hurting other people, right? Like not physically, right? But they are making them worse off by doing it. And I think that, like there are, there's like some kind of good general harm principle about liberty that, there's some kind of boundary when you start doing significant harms to other people. And if epistemic harms are real harms, then I think there's a similar kind of parallel principle. Now, all of that doesn't mean that there's no way that someone can spread misinformation and still not deserve significant consequences. Like I said, people often spread misinformation because they think it's good. I think we should try to do something to stop them from doing that, but I don't know that punishing them is like the appropriate response there, right? That's why I think that like social media companies should be responsible for regulating misinformation, because, my granddad who shares a link to some like wacky fake news site, like, I don't know that he is even the person to be blamed here. But I also think we should find a way to disincentivize his doing that. I don't know if that answers the question all the way, but that's my thinking.
It does, and for the most part, I'm going to agree with what you just said. But the other thing I have in mind, and you hear people say this a lot, and in fact, you brought it up for a moment. You hear people say, First Amendment in the United States, you have the right to say and believe what you want. I mean, where's the fine line there? I mean, obviously, something like Twitter, it's a private company. And there's a lot of jokes about that right now with the Elon Musk thing, but it's a private company, and yes, Twitter can establish their own policies about what you can do on their platform in the same way that Walmart or the Catholic Church can establish their own policies about what you do in their buildings. So, but in the public forum, if you're going out there and intentionally spreading bullshit, for lack of a better word, how are you going to, like, even if we know that it's false, sure, you can say that you're epistemically harming them, but unless the false information literally puts that person in harm's way, how can that actually be criminally liable without breaking certain constitutional rights, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it does. And one possible answer is that it can't. So like it might be that there is not a way of constructing a society that handles information the way, I mean, I haven't really argued for like the claim that information should be handled in any particular way, but like there's a way that I think information should be handled. And it might be that it is incompatible with the Bill of Rights. Like that might just be true. I'm not enough of an expert on either the details of how I think information should be handled or like what the appropriate interpretation of the First Amendment is to really like know for sure whether there's a way of making them fit together. But that's one answer. I mean, it might be that we are, because you would expect that to be the case, right? Like if you write a set of rules, it might later turn out that the way you want your society to be is incompatible with that set of rules. And that's okay, right? Like maybe I'm advocating for amending the Constitution, or maybe I'm advocating for just like a strong Supreme Court decision that reinterprets the First Amendment or something to deal with misinformation in a better way. So that could happen. And if it does, I mean, that's unfortunate in certain ways, but.
Historically, that's very probable. That's how Rome became an empire.
Yeah, right. So yeah, that might be the case. However, I do think that there is at least one possible avenue of understanding and making sense of it. Really, it's sort of two-pronged, I guess, right? So via the notion of harm, I think we can say one of two different things, or maybe both. One thing we could say is, well, look, we're going to take harm limitations on free speech seriously, right? So no, I can't incite people to violence. I can't, I'm not allowed to speak in a way that puts people in immediate danger, like yelling fire in a crowded theater or whatever, right? Like there are limitations on my right to free speech. And maybe one of those limitations should be a limitation that has to do with epistemic harm. Now it doesn't follow from that like if you say something and it causes any epistemic harm at all, then you've done something bad, right? But there might be like significant, sufficiently egregious cases where my liberty should appropriately be blocked because me saying what I'm saying would cause too much just plain old epistemic harm. It would lead to too many bad beliefs or whatever. So there's that possibility. If you're not sympathetic to that, and I wouldn't blame you. I think people don't really think about epistemic harm as real harm. Most people don't think about epistemic harm at all. But there are also pretty clear cases of epistemic harm being causally connected to other kinds of harms, right? So I can lead people to believe something false or to doubt something that they have good reasons to believe is true in a way that is harmful to them. So I think like that's a reasonable charge that people made against tobacco companies, right? In suppressing evidence about connecting heavy smoking with increased risk of lung cancer. I think you can say, well, look, there's the spreading of misinformation, and that spreading of misinformation caused this further harm. And that's why it's okay to restrict speech in this kind of case. It's not the epistemic harm all by itself, but it's because the epistemic harm led to this other clear physical harm. Or if you think about like, like the January 6th insurrection, right? Like think about all the property destruction and loss of life in that case, right? There's a very, I don't know about simple story, like there's a reasonably direct story connecting the spreading of misinformation with those events. And so I think you can make a case that, well, it's not that we're saying just the epistemic harms, just the bad beliefs on their own are enough that we should, impose whatever consequences. It's that those epistemic harms then went out to have other physical harms. And we've already sort of set the precedent that it's okay to restrict speech when it leads to those kinds of harms. So, that would be a sort of weaker position, right? It's not that all misinformation should be punished or that all epistemic harms should face, spreaders of epistemic harm should face consequences. But if you're spreading epistemic harms in a way that also is causally connected to these other kinds of harms, then in those cases, there ought to be consequences. I would like to see consequences even when there aren't further harms, but yeah. So I think you could in that way make the restriction of spreading misinformation compatible with other kinds of limitations that we already have on First Amendment protected kinds of expression.
I would like to submit, and just, sorry, this may have been mentioned while I had to step out a moment ago. I was gone for 20 minutes-ish. But I do want to mention that, yeah, as we're talking about like ameliorative understandings of misinformation and the potential for doing things at the level of law and politics to combat the role of misinformation and making our political situation worse, it is going to be important to like carry forward the understanding of misinformation as something that's very difficult to track in its causal relationships, right? We have a phenomenon that I've heard termed stochastic terrorism, whereby various people with clout purport things that are presuppositions that are not direct calls to action, calls to violence, but nevertheless cause events like the Capitol riots, which were extraordinary. Not the most violent thing we've seen in recent history by far, but quite violent and caused fairly directly by rhetoric from, at the time, the Republican Party mainstream. Which is to say that like there's got to be some way of holding that kind of perpetuators of that kind of harm to account without having, I don't know, without being able to track every node of information spreading that obtained in the course of events, I guess. And so yeah, like that, I'm not sure exactly how to go about solving that problem, but there you go. I hear in the chat, closing down TikTok might be a step in the right direction. Maybe. I have my own reasons to dislike TikTok, but one of them is that it's very good. You know, I don't know if this was mentioned either, but when we talk about like the conceit of being good information, being epistemically useful, being part of the harm that misinformation causes, maybe being part of the definition of misinformation, depending on how we cash it out theoretically, TikTok is a natural environment for that kind of thing to happen because it demands such short form content, which demands truncation of potentially very complex situations and ideas, which necessitates that you present them in this sort of short form, confident way that you only arrive at if you have very little time to get across an idea. So it's like we have in TikTok an environment designed to promote epistemic harm, if not misinformation more specifically. Because anytime you try to represent something complicated in such a short form format, you're going to do it injustice.
I just don't like TikTok because I'm old.
Well, yeah, it's also garbage, but
yeah,
like,
same. My inner millennial hates it so much.
I will say, so I think that is a good point, and I had sort of spelled things out in terms of prescribing consequences for misinformation, but that's not the only approach to limiting it, right? Like you could just remove some of the tremendous incentives people have to spread misinformation, right? Like if making money on the internet wasn't so tied to just getting people to click on and engage with your stuff, then it wouldn't be such a good money-making strategy to just put out a bunch of junk, right? If the economic models were different, we might have less misinformation without, criminalizing or even setting any kind of civil liability for it, right? Like you can disincentivize it by making other things more profitable. I would be okay with that too, except that I don't really like profit, but that's a whole other conversation.
And that's how we got from epistemology to socialism. Yes, we did it, team.
So brief thought, and this is totally off topic. If you're still recording, you can end it here. This isn't something that needs to be continued, but so if did William say he's socialist? This is where I end my complete opposite end of the spectrum. But if anyone in here is familiar with the political philosophy of Leo Strauss, completely not socialist, his idea is that society engages with what you make the ends of society of. And if your ends is money, people are going to do whatever it takes to get money. And, you know, I mean, I would say I agree with that.
Yes, I think that idea is very much sort of what I'm trying to appeal to, right? It's like set the system up such that spreading good information is like what's beneficial to you. Like how you get ahead in society is by posting the best researched, most carefully considered stuff or whatever.
Now, speaking of January 6th, it may come as irony that that particular political philosopher was an arch conservative, but
Well, I'd argue that some of our best contributions to every field have been skepticism, though. And that kind of following the status quo isn't necessarily the best thing to do. Now, I do agree with the malice point wholeheartedly. I think this epistemic harm thing is a very good theory in terms of just if it is defined what that harm is. I think you're right on the money. And I think the word that really jumps out at me is unjustified. I think justification is where this thing hinges on whether or not that information was in any way justified when it was brought forward. And I think on the skepticism side, based on you not knowing everything with anything that you put forward, there's always that little bit of skepticism. There's always a little bit there that is justified to balance out dogmatic belief of I'm always going to lose the lottery, even though no, there is that one chance that you can in fact. And so that's just as much misinformation to me as the other side that says, if I don't win the lottery, it was rigged.
Yes, so I think there's an idea there that I really appreciate you bringing up, Blake, because it's a virtue of my view that I forgot to extol, which is because the sort of range of types of epistemic harms is fairly broad, you can determine that something is misinformation by this definition without settling the question of whether the claim is true, right? So maybe we disagree about some matter of fact, whatever it is, right? And if all we have to go on is, well, misinformation is false information, well, then if I'm trying to demonstrate that what you say is false is misinformation, you're accusing me of misinformation, like we're just like reiterating our disagreement, right? Like you're just saying, well, no, what you're saying is false. And I'm saying, no, what you're saying is false. And that's all there is to it, right? But we can identify misinformation without worrying about that in at least some range of cases, right? So like, it might be that there's the claim you're making, and then like there's the set of reasons you have for your claim. And I can identify that the set of reasons is a bad set of reasons without settling the question of whether the claim is true or false. So I could attack your justification, right? And claim that it's misinformation for that reason. Or maybe we're thinking about like a news organization and you reported this thing and maybe it's true and maybe it's false, but by tracking, what happened in your email conversations, we can tell that you didn't responsibly investigate it at all. So that's enough for us to identify it as epistemically harmful for you to like pass it off as something that you did responsibly investigate, right? And we can do that without settling the truth question, which is, it's not gonna be helpful in every case, but in some cases that's gonna be helpful in allowing us to identify a case of misinformation, even when we're in deep disagreement about the facts of the matter.
Well, whatever that combination of, you need a little bit of people that are believing the well-founded evidence. There's some people that are saying, kind of on the fence. Some people are saying, this feels kind of weird. And then, the two ends of the spectrum of like, both sides may not be good information. But I feel like regardless what that balance is, if it goes towards a epistemic, if it goes closer to knowledge, then that would be the goal of reducing that epistemic harm.
Yeah, or at least if it pulls back from, I don't know, anti-knowledge is not a thing, but like there are beliefs that are worse than having no belief at all, right? Like you're not only not getting knowledge, but you've been pulled like further away from it than when you hadn't thought about it at all. And so those are also epistemic harms. And it's true, like, I don't know whether it's the case that like skeptical thoughts have been like our best epistemic contributors, but if it is, this view can account for that too, right? Because we were like too confident, like we believed more strongly than we should have. And so the like dogmatic status quo information was being epistemically harmful. It was making us too confident. And so these appropriate doubting, dissenting opinions sort of brought us back in check, made our epistemic situation better. So those were good, non-misinformational things, right? So that's, again, just to say that my view is very flexible and can account for everything and is the best.
You just have to pull up short of insurrection. That's the only.
That's the ideal.
Yeah.
Peaceful transitions of power are good. That's a position I'll commit to. All right.
I'm just wondering briefly, as we're on this,
I should go after this one, but yeah, go ahead.
This is coming from what you said, the Blake's question on this last slide. Now, much like it can be unclear that something that might seem to us as clearly misinformation, it might be unclear if it's true or false. Isn't it possible that it's also unclear that it's harmful? Like, for instance, someone may have read, and this is a real thing, like there really was a research on this, even though it's very controversial nowadays with the studies and the fact it's tied to conspiracy theories nowadays. But in the late 90s, there actually was a study on the connection between like vaccines and autism and that sort of thing. It was disconnected because they didn't go together. Like there wasn't a causal factor or strong enough correlation, that sort of thing. Now, let's say someone read that and they weren't informed of all the details. What if that's another
I was
thing.
commenting back to you in real time.
But basically read something that has been discounted along those lines. I just thought that was an example because you brought that up. And you see some meme because it's a politically contentious issue and you're like, oh, what about it? The news is BSing me or something. And basically you're led to confirm that there's just a mass of confusion. Obviously there's what you can call an epistemic harm on one side there, but if you're the person who read an actual academic study on what's going around as a conspiracy theory nowadays, you're not going to know, if that makes sense, from that person's perspective. It's not very clear that it's harmful.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I think the case of Andrew Wakefield's like pilot study from the 90s is an interesting one, precisely because it was intended as misinformation from go. That was never, as far as investigations have found, it was always a monetarily motivated pilot study that falsified its own evidence at every step. If you even like read the text of the study, it mentions things like that the parents were like intuitively attributing the onset of symptoms of autism to the MMR vaccine, and not even all of the parents studied did so, and not even all of the kids who were, this investigation revealed this later, not even all of the kids who were evaluated as autistic were in fact autistic, et cetera, et cetera. The problems with this study run pretty deep, and a lot of them are really obvious to anybody who, reads a sex study, which I understand is not common. Like, why would you at this point in history? But yeah, it winds up being interesting precisely because it was always misinformation with the like conceit of it being epistemically useful when it wasn't. But conversely, you can encounter cases like you described, where a study finds something with all due diligence that turns out to be not the case, right? Like replication studies are a thing for this exact reason in the scientific industry, or at least they're supposed to be. because you can encounter, especially pilot studies with relatively small sample sizes and so on, that are perpetuating the wrong idea quite by accident, in all good faith, etc. Which is to say that there is this virtue of skepticism embedded there as well. And there are ways in which information can be published that is wrong, that nevertheless does not cause epistemic harm by its being wrong, by its making false propositions, because it does so in this context, with the benefit of the broader scientific investigative process, is what I would contribute to that. Forgive me if I'm like missing your point there.
No, I think Blake's comment got what I'm getting at. I didn't realize that the vaccine thing was problematic from the get-go, but that I wasn't sticking to that per se. It was just an example. But Blake's comment, what if it isn't meant as epistemically harmful, but it what if the process isn't, but hold on, what if
Well,
the thing that
say Twitter gives you access to there's no clean water in Flint, Michigan, and it also gives you misinformation about some other social event.
That's along the lines of what I was getting at.
So you should keep if it works out as a net gain, you should keep Twitter, but if it ends up a net negative, you should dump it.
Yeah, so I guess
I was asking. I don't know. I mean, your response is probably making utilitarian Daniel happy though about net gains.
Daniel thinks you should burn Twitter regardless.
So there's one question we might ask, which is like, of this piece of information, is this a piece of misinformation, right? And then there's another question about like sources and whether they're getting us mostly good information or not, and whether we should keep them, and how those things are connected, right? Because bad sources can give you good information sometimes, and good sources can give you bad information sometimes. It doesn't immediately follow from receiving one piece of misinformation from a source that you should eliminate it. Maybe there are other good reasons to eliminate Twitter. But this is just a worry to put in your minds based on what Daniel said here in the chat, right? So there is this problem with all social science studies, basically, where, so I made the case earlier that bare statistical evidence is never sufficient for knowledge. I think that's true. Studies that people report on give bare statistical evidence. So when we talk about these kinds of, like when people talk about distinguishing correlation from causation, that's a good and important thing to do, but that's not even the whole issue, right? The concern is we set a threshold for statistical significance. It doesn't really matter where we set it, but we set it somewhere. And wherever we set it, that will determine the number of studies that we would have to run to get this result if there was really nothing going on, right? And that number is going to be something, and it kind of doesn't matter what it is. All we're going to get is like, well, there's a reason of this probabilistic strength to think that there's a connection here, right? But that's just going to be like your lottery evidence. An unfortunate consequence of that is that those kinds of results can't ever give you knowledge. That I'm saying something like slightly radical there, but here's the worry, right? People are like, oh, it's science. Science is a way of knowing about the world. This study says this, so now we know that's true, right? Now that starts to sound like misinformation, in the sense that, like, in the context, people are taking it to be knowledge granting information, but it's not knowledge granting information. It's bare statistical evidence. I don't have anything sophisticated to say about that problem, but I think it's a problem. It's not even that people are overestimating, like reasonably informed people are overestimating the odds that the result is like accurate and indicative of something. It's that they think they have knowledge on the basis of that kind of information because they don't recognize it as being like lottery information. Anyway, that's a whole other project that does not really.
Well, and if you share it for the same reason, like say an election, on either side of that, they would have the same reason, either if one was like from a statistical evidence-based standpoint of, no, we absolutely did this 100%, even though it's not 100%. And the other side said, no, 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 we did this because we feel this way. We really have nothing backing us, but we feel this way. They're both trying to get the same thing with something that's not 100% accurate, in my opinion.
I know you got. I know you got to go, Professor Carey. But just
sorry, I got sucked back in, but I should go. But thank you for having me. Can I make one
Thank you for
small
being here.
request before I leave? Yeah, I'm happy to be here as always. My one small request is, can I get a link to wherever these videos go? Just because I would like to share it with my students.
Let me see if I can find. I have a bad setup for uploading and managing these videos. So let me figure that out for just a moment here.
It doesn't even need to
is
be
it-
right now. You can just
Yeah.
shoot me now. It's fine. I just like to, students who can't come to club meetings based on timing or whatever. I just like to give them the option to watch the talks. That's all.
yeah, I can remind you, William, if you need sort of reminders to get this one on particular as soon as possible. But the thing I was going to say is, we don't have time to discuss it now, but I would give pushback that with social scientific studies, all we have is bare statistical knowledge, but we don't have time to discuss it now. You got to go.
Yeah, it's a big thing. I made a very controversial and poorly supported argument there, but I am deeply worried about social science studies and the kind of evidence they give us and the kind of evidence we act like they are. But anyway, we can talk about that another time. Thanks again for having me, folks. Happy to be here.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you for coming. William posted the link to the YouTube channel in the chat. I don't know, when do you think you'll have the video itself up on the YouTube channel, William?
Oh, I don't know. I'm not sure what I'm doing for the rest of the night, but we'll see. Let's say by Monday it will be there.
No rush on my account anyway. Thanks again.
But yeah, there's also like the rest of our
Yeah,
catalog.
that's what I was mostly looking for, is the archive.
There you go.
All right, see you folks. Have a good
See you.
weekend.
Thank you. I suppose we shall end it there. Are there any final comments from anybody just in the room at the moment? This is not necessarily the last time we talk about misinformation, either on the channel or amongst ourselves, but like, there's anything
No,
we
I
wanna
don't
share?
think so. Dylan, you got any comments? Oh, Dylan might have a comment.
No, but thank you.
Okay.
Okay, then yeah, we'll let that not be the definitive end, because this is a complex issue that I personally find myself invested in, although I wasn't able to do a ton with it this particular meeting. But yeah, I'll just outro us, I suppose. Thank you, everybody who stopped by, especially to Professor Carey, and to those of you who are watching this after the fact in the archive.
Hi, future people.
You're doing the thing, man. You're doing the thing I want you to do by uploading these videos. So yeah, that's it for now. Thank you, and we will see you soon.
Fingers up.
Bye.